So today I'm meeting with Sherri Irvin, who is Senior Associate Dean of the Graduate College and Presidential Research Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Sherri graduated with a PhD degree from Princeton, and she specializes in aesthetics and the philosophy of art. Her interests range widely, but she has written extensively on matters related to contemporary art and on aesthetic experience in everyday life. In her recent book, Immaterial, The Rules of Contemporary Art, which has just been published from Oxford, that means in 2022, just last year, she argues that contemporary artworks are partly constituted by rules and discuss the relevance of these issues for art appreciation and value. Her edited collection, Body Aesthetics, has been published from Oxford in 2016 and is a multi-authored collection that treats the aesthetics of the body in relation to social justice, art, evolutionary theory, race, gender, disability, sexuality, and sport. Her current research centers on the intersections of aesthetics and justice. In addition, Sherri serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Aesthetics and Philosophy Compass. And we too, Sherri and I, met very many years ago in Amsterdam when she was invited to speak during one of the project meetings to the project members' new strategies for the conservation of contemporary art. And I found her research and approaches to contemporary art and contemporary art conservation really, really inspiring. I'm not the only one. I know her writings are very widely read by contemporary art conservators, and it is my really huge pleasure, Sherri, that you agreed to meet with me today. So thank you again for this meeting. And here are my two questions. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? If not, why not? And what does it mean to conserve performance?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation, Hanna. It's really delightful to talk to someone whose interests overlap with mine, but from a different disciplinary perspective. I want to just highlight that I am not an art historian. I'm a philosopher. And so I think about these questions from a somewhat different angle than probably some of the conservation professionals and scholars who have engaged in these conversations before. In my book, Immaterial, I focus more on object-based works. I talk a little bit about performance, but not as much, because some of the phenomena that I think about really draw on a background of like what is going on in this particular art form. And performance art has its own history and its own conventions. And so I'm really just trying to apply some of my thinking from another context into this context. So I want to start with the question of, I guess, overlapping questions of can performance art be conserved and what would it mean to conserve it? Whether or not a work of performance art can be conserved, in my view, is going to be a question of what precisely is the work as the artist has specified it. So when I think about the creation of an artwork, the artist both engages in some design activities, sometimes some fabrication activities, but part of what they're doing is they're specifying this entity here is my work. And those are somewhat separable processes. So an artist might participate in, if we're thinking about performance, they might participate in an event or create an event or engage in an action, which is an event of fixed duration. But they also then get to do a second thing, which is to say that event that is now over was my work. Or they can say, my work is an inherently repeatable structure. So the event that I just participated in or the action I just took was perhaps the first instance of the work, but it is a repeatable work and it can be given further instances in the future. And if they choose to do that, then it's up to them to determine like what are the conditions that, so sometimes this is spoken of as a performance score. They get to talk about what are the aspects of that first event that would have to be replicated in order for it to count as a further instance of the work. And what are the things that were variable and don't have to be repeated? So that's now, of course, sometimes an artist engages in a performance and then they don't speak to that question of, do they think of it as a unique event or as an inherently repeatable structure? Sometimes a person is thinking of something as a repeatable structure, but they haven't yet expressed or spelled out what are the conditions for its repeatability. Sometimes an artist engages in an action, a performance that seems like a unique event, and then at some later time, they decide, oh, you know what, we can do that pattern again. And I'm going to consider that to be a further instance of this same work. So whether or not the work itself can be conserved, for me, I think this gets to the meaning of what it would mean to conserve these works. I think of conservation as a matter of taking the work itself and trying to make sure that it carries forward. If the work is a unique performance that has ended, I don't think that that particular work can be conserved per se. But of course, there are lots of other conservation related activities that can be done in relation to documenting that event, preserving any documentation. And documenting, of course, is going to include getting people's memories, talking to the artist about their own experiences, all that sort of thing. But it won't be a matter of conserving the work, in my view. But where you have a work that is repeatable, that's the thing that can be conserved. And conserving it is going to involve pinning down what would be needed in order for that performance, work of performance to be reinstantiated, and making sure that you're conserving that information. So that's kind of a start in terms of the framework that I'm going to speak from. You know, there are a couple of things that are coming to my mind. One of them is, as I said, I really think the artist has the prerogative, and I do sort of think the default with performance art tends to be to regard, a performance once delivered as a non-repeatable event. And so sometimes you have situations like Pope L, who does these crawling performances. And there are multiple crawling performances that he has engaged in, but he doesn't conceive them as instances of the same thing. Each of them is a unique performance. And, I kind of think that fits very much with an understanding of how each performance is related to its specific context, the specific time, the specific place that led him to choose to engage in that act there. Then you have situations like, I think about Marina Abramovich and her performance in Ponderabilia with Ulay, which I think was first in 1977, and they're in an Italian gallery, and they're standing nude in this doorway, and they're facing each other. And in order to get into the gallery, people are having to turn to the side. And that, I think for a long period of time, would have seemed like a work that could only be, it had a single realization, and it was a non-repeatable event. And yet then with her retrospective in, I think, 2010 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the work was conceived now as we might think of it as a repeatable version of the earlier work, where now all of a sudden you have different performers who are being hired to perform the work, and they're doing a different physical configuration for accessibility purposes where they're further apart. And I think accessibility and perhaps also the safety of the performers, because as Ulay and Abramovich spoke of this, it's a vulnerable position to be nude so close to your audience. So there are these questions about, is that really the same work, or is that a different version of the earlier work, which was itself a one-off performance? I think those are very legitimate kinds of questions when we think about a difference in structure, a difference in who is performing, and how their identity relates to the original creative act. In terms of being forward-looking, I think the question that you're asking and some of what I've said connects to the idea that the artist may not actually have fixed in their mind the issue of, do I see this as a repeatable thing or not? artists can engage in actions, they can create things and not yet have a sense of, am I understanding the structure as repeatable in some way with variability, or am I understanding it as unique? And there's an interesting role for conservators to play in engaging in dialogue with the artist to try to understand that. But there is also a very legitimate concern that a conservator can be interventionist in asking those questions. And Sannika Stigter has written about this in her own work and talking about her engagement with Jan Dibbets in a work that's not a performance work, but that does have a performative element of its realization of applying tape in the gallery when light is coming in through the windows, applying tape to capture the shadows throughout the course of the day. And that work was originally conceived as a non-repeatable work. It was included in an exhibition, but there was no thought of someone purchasing it because it was not understood as repeatable. Years later, there was this thought, oh, well, maybe this is actually a repeatable work. And Dibbets worked with Sannika Stigter and others to sort of specify what's involved. But the questioning and the engagement around that can shape and alter the artist's thinking about whether it's repeatable and what are the key elements. And so there's an interesting issue of reflexivity for the conservator who is trying to be proactive in conserving a work. At what point are you inserting yourself into the creative process and thus into the resulting nature of the work? And at what point should you be cautious about doing that?
Yes, absolutely. And it's also very interesting because you raised this issue of intentionality or intention, right? That is quite often understood by conservators as something fixed related to the artwork's origin and to the artist's kind of initial concept of the work, but in fact is something that evolves and changes over time. And I really like that you bring up all these examples in relation to our initial question of performance art. You bring up all these examples of installation art, conceptual art, right? Other perhaps also time-based media in your book. Many of those examples were also present, and I appreciate reading it so much. And in one of those passages, I think in your book, let me just very briefly pull up my notes. You state that there is almost like no difference between the material of some works as an event rather than an object, right? For many artworks in new media, it is hard to pin down what the material is at all. Neither a thing nor an event label works very well. And I wonder whether, we could think about this on another perhaps metaphysical level, that performance might in fact be, conceived of a kind of a short, as a short existing object, and an object as a long kind of lasting performance. Whether you might have some thoughts on this, and especially and always with reference to this question of conservation of performance from the beginning, obviously.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about the kind of unique performances, let's think about Touching Xie, one of his long durational performances, a year-long performance like the time clock piece, where every hour for an entire year, he punched a time clock, right? We've got that event, and it's true. That's sort of like if we think about that on the analogy of an object-based work, you could think about a painter could create a painting, and you could think about somebody like Saburo Murakami, who created these paintings that are designed for the paint to flake. Maybe somebody could create a painting that is designed to evolve over a year, and then it's destroyed at the end. And you'd have a very similar sort of structure, I think, in terms of what the work is understood as being. The work itself has a fixed set duration, and at the conclusion of that, it is in the past. But at the same time, then you have all of the apparatus that Xie was certainly thinking of being able to continue to present, or maybe even to a certain extent, start presenting it to a public after the year is over. Because of course, those works are interesting in that no one can actually, with one of those durational works by Xie, no one is in a position to actually observe or watch the performance as it unfolds. The event is too long. No one's there except him. He's his only audience during the performance. And so the understanding that there has to be an apparatus for presenting that to a public is really critical. And so that really raises questions about, I sort of spoke earlier about conservation as we're trying to conserve the work itself, and documentation is separate. And yes, of course, you need to preserve that too. But I do think some of these works raise the question of conservation of that documentation in an extremely acute way. You know, what if the artist says the work is this event, but in terms of what we present to the public, I'm very intentional about that as well. That may raise some additional, very acute conservation concerns. Now I feel like I've moved away from your question a little bit there. But when I think about the conservation of the object-based works, I am thinking about, very often there is an essential object which has to be present for each display. But then there's other information that we need to understand what the full work is. And that might be an opportunity for an audience to engage with that object. And so conserving the object itself is not yet sufficient for conserving the work. You've got to conserve the full conditions for being able to present the work with the information the audience needs to grasp it. And I guess I see the same thing as being true for a repeatable work of performance art. You need to be able to present a structure that's kind of constitutes what the work is. And you also need to ensure that you've got enough information about what's going on with that structure for the audience to be able to appreciate it. So I do think, as you said, there are some notable parallels if we're talking about repeated display of an object-based work and conservation of a repeatable work of performance art.
I really love this, your example of Xie, because it brings us also to the way how artists themselves conceive of the afterlife, say, of their works. And I think Xie is very particular, very intricate about this, and also about the things that he doesn't sanction, right, or he sanctioned differently. I remember one of his presentations in Chicago at SAIC, which I enjoyed very much. And I was trying as a young PhD student at that time to kind of record some of this, and I was taken out from the audiences, and was asked to kind of delete this recording. So there is this certain narrative that he allows, within which the wax is allowed to exist, but any other or the remediation of it isn't allowed, which is quite, I think, interesting. But this brings me to this kind of idea that, to two ideas. One idea is that presentation quite often equals preservation of the work, of performance work. And perhaps you could talk a little bit more about this. And the other is institutional structures that are built around those works, and especially structures which takes us away slightly from perhaps thinking about the works in terms of ontology only, but bring us back to think about those works in terms of ecologies, like, the support structures that the artists create perhaps themselves, but also this kind of networks of care that are larger than the artists and the artwork, right, that are the conservators, the curators, the communities of practices, and so on and so forth. I would love to hear from you about, on this issue of the relation of ontologies to ecologies, and whether one excludes the other, or whether, in your opinion, especially as philosopher in this particular tradition, whether we should put actually ontology in front of ecologies here.
I don't usually use the word ecology in my work, but I think for me, I feel like our understandings of the ontology kind of have to grow out of the ecology. I don't think we should be trying to force a prior ontological conception onto the practices within an art form and within an artistic community. And so I really try not to do that in my work and hope that I'm not doing that. When I think about the ontology of the work, one of the questions I ask is, what are the practices through which the nature of the work is specified? And so what is the ecology surrounding the work? And I want to go back to that example from Sonika Stigter's work with Jan Dibbets again, even though, as I said, that's not a work of performance art, but because there's this element of action in installing the work, Sonika Stigter and her team had to really work with Jan Dibbets to install the work and to have a dialogue about how to do that in order to pin down what are the conditions for repeating this work? What do we actually have to do? Because it's not all just something where you can have a written instruction manual. There was observing the way that he would cut the tape as he was sort of taping off the boundary or the shadow around the light cast in through a window. And she actually said, actively installing this work is a conservation treatment. If you lose the knowledge of how to actually do the thing that he is wanting you to do in installing the work, you kind of lose the ability to install the work properly. So she said a conservation treatment would be to have a new conservator present for each installation to learn this so that you can keep passing the knowledge down. So to me, what that says is the rules for installing the work, the conditions that constitute the repeatable structure are not just, things that you can spell out in a numbered list. They do have to do with know-how and with practice. So I think a lot of the same thing is true if we think about works of performance. Whether or not somebody can repeat a work of performance art, it really does depend on what exactly is the structure that is to be repeated, and what do you have to know and perhaps embody in order to be able to repeat that structure. And the fact that something is repeatable doesn't mean that it's repeatable by just anyone. It doesn't mean that a random person, sometimes the identity of the artist is in some way critical to the nature of the performance. And so you would need to have somebody who maybe shares some aspects of embodiment or shares some aspects of experience to be able to re-perform that piece. And you might have a need for that person to embody some understanding or some knowledge that has been communicated to them by the artist. And that's kind of similar to some of what happens in dance at times. It's not just a matter of perform this action or do this named step, but sometimes you have to learn how to do it in a particular way. But the interesting thing about performance art is that whether or not that's true depends very much on the specific work and on what the artist has indicated there. I also want to signal, and this kind of connects to institutional structures and where they do have a place and where they don't have a place. I mean, a lot of performance art, of course, has been intentionally presented outside of institutional structures, and there's a real tension between the work and what it's trying to do in those intentional structures. And so I think about Adrian Piper's catalysis performances, where she's really very clear about the fact that she is going out into the world, she's immersed her clothing in some kind of smelly substance, or she has stuffed a towel into her mouth, filling her cheeks, and she's got part of the white towel hanging out of her mouth, and she's riding a bus, or she's got sticky stuff all over her and a sign that says wet paint. And she says it's very important to her that it's not presented with a frame saying, this is theater, I am a performance artist. She's just going out into the world like that. And there are these unsuspecting people who just happen to be on that bus or happen to be on that sidewalk who are encountering this and who are having to figure out what's going on. And we're having to live their reactions in the moment to something that is not presented within an artistic frame. And so she's very clear about the fact that she is trying to produce change, to produce catalysis in the audience when she engages in these actions. And she thinks that presenting them inside an institutional art frame will actually prevent that from happening. That it does something to, oh, this is art, so of course weird things can happen here. that the art context does something to interfere with the process of change that she's trying to produce. So on the one hand, you do have these institutional structures that are designed to safeguard a work and to carry it forward. But then you've also got works for which the institutional structure is understood as being a barrier and undermining. And then all that happens is you have a lot of preservation of her words about it and of a few pictures. You don't really have any aspiration, I guess, of conserving the work itself. And I think what she would say is there is no conservation of the work itself.
It's really amazing that you brought up this example, because many of the Fluxus works on which we currently also work in Bern in the other Activating Fluxus project were anti-institutional, were kind of created outside of those institutions in the first place, and nonetheless 40 years after or even later, they became institutionalized, and now they are started to be kind of reactivated also as re-performances, which is quite interesting. But if I could ask you about something else. In your recent article, you really interestingly, for the Bart volume, which I just read, Conserving Active Matter, you really interestingly talk about the idea of exemplification. And I wonder whether we could talk very briefly about the idea of exemplification in relation to performance conservation. Do you think there are aspects of this philosophical concept that might be used for our purposes?
Interesting. Well, let me first say what that concept is. This was an idea of Nelson Goodman, also kind of deepened by Catherine Elgin. And the easiest way to explain it is giving the example of a tailor's swatch. So if you go to the tailor, as we don't do so often anymore, but often they have a little booklet or, wallpaper. They have a booklet of examples of fabric or examples of wallpaper, and you use those to choose, oh yeah, I'd like my suit to be made out of this, or I'd like this on my wall. And Goodman says, the tailor's swatch has all sorts of properties, but the properties it is exemplifying for the purposes of being a tailor's swatch are the properties related to the color and texture of the fabric. The size is not at issue. You're not saying, I want a suit that's only this big when you choose that fabric, and that it has this kind of pinked border that tailor's swatches often have. Those are not the relevant qualities. What you go to the tailor's swatch to find are the key qualities that let you know what the fabric itself is like: color, texture, pattern, and so forth. So the other properties are kind of off to the side a little bit. And so part of the idea is that I was developing in that piece that you mentioned is that when artists use non-standard artistic materials in their work, very often they are exemplifying certain of the features of those materials. If we think about Melvin Edwards, he made a series of sort of abstract looking sculptural works out of barbed wire. And so you've got these kind of long lines, but the fact that they are made out of barbed wire is really important to understanding what Melvin Edwards is doing. Melvin Edwards was an African-American artist. He's working during the Civil Rights era at a time when a lot of white artists were doing similarly structurally minimalist sculptures that were seemed completely divorced from the kind of socio-political events of the day. And by bringing the barbed wire into the gallery, Melvin Edwards was connecting his abstract looking sculptures to political content because of the way that barbed wire is used for containment and for carceral purposes in some contexts. So that was part of what was exemplified by those works. So I guess we can ask similarly, when we think about a work of performance, the artist is embodied in a certain way all the time. So what is it that in a given context of performance, the artist's embodiment or the embodiment of performers what is it that is being exemplified about their embodiment or activity in that context that is especially expressive, even though those are qualities of their embodiment and perhaps qualities of their activity all the time? So I guess if I think about an example, if I think about, now this is from dance, this is not from performance art, but Yvonne Rainer did this performance of, I think, like carrying a mattress around. And so something that's being exemplified there, she could carry a mattress anytime. She might have carried a mattress when she was moving into her apartment. But in a dance context, part of what's being exemplified is a certain ordinariness of movement that is special in the dance context against that background, but that might be normal if she's climbing a staircase or walking around a room. So I think that's an interesting question to ask about when we think about what exactly is it about the event of performance that is special and that might need to be attended to in future presentation, in discussion, in our understanding of the work. What is it about the artist's embodiment or activity that is being exemplified there? And what is it that's just sort of part of the background because that is the artist just being themselves in that context?
So one could by extension say that what could matter for performance conservation would be this understanding what the artist exemplifies by a certain set of gestures or movements. Is it correct?
Right. Yeah. Which aspects of that are really exemplified as opposed to they're just secondarily present there and they're less critical to replicate. Yeah.
So, yes.
When Ule and Abramowitsch talked about imponderabilia, as they originally presented it in 1977, and I remember Ule speaking about this more, although I think this was part of both of their thinking, the idea that the audience member had to choose whether to face, there was a male embodiment and a female embodiment, and the idea that you had to choose which one you were going to face was very important to some of their thinking about that. If that's the case, then that suggests that you need to consider the embodiment for any representation of that work or reactivation. You might need to consider that the notion, and of course, this has, I think, gained a special charge now in the context where there's this contestation of gender versus biological qualities. But you might need to consider that these secondary sex characteristics of the bodies is an important thing that is not just incidentally present, but exemplified in the work.
Absolutely, and we would encourage everyone who's listening to this interview to go back to your book where you also bring this example. And I wonder, Sherri, if I could also ask you a little bit more on this note, because in this BART article you speak about the idea of decay on example of a couple of really interesting works. Zoe Leonard is one of them. But I wonder, is there such a thing in performance as decay in your view? Because I mean, decay is something very inherent to works which are object-based, no? But could we think about performance as a form which also perhaps exemplifies decay? I find that sometimes putting performance into the shoes of object-based forms allows us to understand better what that performance actually is. If decay is possible in performance, then how would a patina or all this kind of more traditional conservation of objects, how would this play out in the conservation of performance?
The first thing that I immediately think of here is, so when I talk about object-based works, there can be decay in an object. Of course, it can lose parts. There can also be decay in the information about what the associated rules are. If there are specific ways that a group of objects has to be installed and we lose that information, that is degradation or decay of the work, just as much as decay of the object is. And there are specific works, and I'm thinking here of the works of Tino Sehgal, for example, where he kind of builds in a process of decay. So Tino Sehgal's works of performance art, when he sells them to a museum, for instance, Pip Lawrenson has talked about this in relation to his selling a work to Tate. He doesn't allow official notes or documentation of what the structure is that has to be reperformed to present the work. he sort of verbally communicates this information to the staff, and they're allowed to go back in their office and make some notes for their own use, but there is no official file. That's the way that he specifies these works. And interestingly, I think it was the same year, and even on the same trip that I met you in Amsterdam, I went to a workshop that Tino Segal had at Tate. And there were people in the workshop who had previously performed some of his works, and he was training those of us present on how to perform one of the works that some of them had previously performed. And it was clear that the instructions he was giving at that time for like how many times to repeat certain words were different from what the performers had previously been trained to do in performing that same work. So even the artist's own memory of what the structure is that has to be repeated was decaying, and that was evident. And so if he doesn't permit any documentation and there's just this sort of verbal transfer, then there's going to be constantly, inevitably, an evolution of what that structure is understood to be. That seems like a description of decay. At the same time, that's also a kind of, that's an illustration of a sort of long verbal tradition where you just have a built-in process whereby structures change. So should we think of that as decay? It's decay relative to an understanding of an original pristine object, but it is a way in which, in a sense, over time, this repeatable structure does kind of gain a patina. Right? Because maybe there are some things, aspects of the structure that the performers are asked to do that are kind of weird and uncomfortable. And so maybe people's memories, including the artist's memory over time, kind of changes in ways that smooth over uncomfortable parts, or who knows, and you end up with a somewhat different structure, but one that still has its own viability. And then kind of a rather different example, but it's called to my mind again by thinking about imponderabilia. The artist's body also changes over time. And when Ule talked about that work, that he and Abramowitz were talking about it much later in an interview, and he mentioned how they were both extremely slender at the time that the work was originally performed, and that their feet were the part of their body that protruded the most and kind of created a special obstacle. Whereas as they were later embodied, as often happens to us as humans, our bodies change over time. And so that might not be the part of the body that protrudes the most. So if an artist is repeating their own work, their body changes over time. I wouldn't think of that as decay, but I would think of that as an aspect of, what is going to be present in a reperformance that is going to be necessarily different from what was originally present if the artist is reperforming or their own works over time.
This is a fantastic answer. We also had Marina speaking with us, in the project, and it was fantastic actually to also hear how open she is towards those bodily changes, and how she acknowledges, that her body and all other bodies change over time, and this is a part of the work, or not, if the performance is delegated, whatever that delegation, might mean. If we were to conceive of a performance that is perfectly conservable, what would it be?
I think the most easily conservable performance is going to be one where you have a simple specification where it is repeatable, perhaps by people who are very differently embodied, and it's a very straightforward thing to do, where our knowledge of the act of what is meant by that instruction over time is unlikely to significantly degrade. So, if you have a simple instruction like clap your hands, that's going to be an easily conservable work. But of course, it's not going to necessarily be the kind of work that has the depth and richness of so many performance artworks. But the easier it is to specify the actions, to almost notate them, so that there's a very clear structure that you can easily record and replicate. That's going to be the most easily conservable work. But that doesn't, probably to think of it that way is going to mean that you just lose so many rich and interesting works. So let me kind of, if we think about the richness and diversity of performance artworks that actually exist, I sort of feel like there can be a few different targets of what conservation is trying to conserve for us. And one of them is an entity, a structure. And so what I just described was you're able to conserve a repeatable structure in a very easy way, right? Of course, conserving a painting can be very difficult, but if you do it well, you've got the thing there. But you may also be needing to conserve some aspects of our ability to understand what the work is that goes beyond the nature of the object. There may be elements of the significance of aspects of the work that are not just directly readable off of the artist's actions or directly readable off of a material artwork. So you may need to conserve the information that will help us understand what that work was. But another thing is our ability to have the kind of experience that the artist was trying to make available to us or to design for us. And that may be something that goes beyond either of those other two things. So there's a work, or a series of works by the Brazilian artist Lygia Clark called her bichos, or critters. And they're these sheet metal sculptures. They're usually about, kind of around this size, where you can fold them and arrange them in certain ways. And they're pretty unwieldy, they'll kind of flap around and, like land with a bang. You try to do certain things to them. Many people have described the difficulties of manipulating these works. Now, most of the originals you're no longer allowed to manipulate. They're precious objects, they're vulnerable. And you mentioned reactivation. There's been an attempt to sort of reactivate them in a sense by replicating the objects, creating versions of the objects that have the same material qualities and that people are allowed to play around with and learn from and have an experience of. And it's not the original that she created that you're playing with, but you're still able to have and ask the kind of experience that she wanted people to have. And so I think conservation in terms of making available a kind of experience is quite important. And that reactivation, as you mentioned, of a work that you can't necessarily conserve by presenting exactly that structure to an audience, that can be very valuable in terms of ensuring that the work continues to have a kind of experiential life for an audience to learn from. And that goes beyond just conserving a specific kind of repeatable structure, or even just conserving the knowledge, because I can know that you're allowed to play with those sheet metal, or that the artist wanted you to be able to play with them. And I can watch a video, but that's a completely different experiential thing than me playing with it myself. So if we can find ways of making the experience available to people, even if what they're experiencing is not the original work or an actual instance of repetition, that's a valuable kind of conservation project as well.